From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Virginia parents ask the Supreme Court to take what could be the next big case on racial preferences in education. Plus, listeners write in on tariffs and the 2024 presidential contest. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnists Bill McGurn and Kim Strassel. The Supreme Court's ruling this year in Students for Fair Admissions, the case on the admissions policies of Harvard and the University of North Carolina, was a big change to the law, and the reverberations at colleges and other big institutions will continue to be felt for some time. But now the justices are being asked to put a punctuation mark on their statement against race preferences. A petition was filed last week by the Coalition for TJ, which represents parents and students interested in Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology, a public school in Alexandria, Virginia. And their objection is to the new admissions criteria. Let's hear from the Coalition for TJ co-founder on Fox News Friday.
The so-called race-neutral factors are not really. It is anything but. It is racially motivated, and the coalition believes that it's a form of modern redlining, where when you isolate certain, majority Asian Asian American applicants, you are essentially limiting the number of Asians who can get enrollment in the school.
Bill, your column this week is on this controversy and Thomas Jefferson High School. What is the case that the parents are making?
Well, the case is a question that was left open by the Harvard and North Carolina's decisions in June. And they ruled directly that racial preferences are unconstitutional. You can't deliberately go about using racial preferences to get the racial balance you want in a class. But what they left open is whether you can use facially neutral, in other words, categories that aren't racial in themselves, to achieve racial ends. And that's what's at stake in Thomas Jefferson. Under the old merit system, which is really based on one very rigorous exam, they had enrollment that was about 73% Asian American because they were the smartest kids in the district. So they were trying to change that. And they put in a requirement that admissions would now take 1.5% from each eighth grade. And that meant because the Asian Americans came from largely 6 or 7 feeder schools, now instead of competing against the whole district, they were really competing among themselves. And so the number went down. And so the question is, can you use something that's neutral to achieve a racial goal? I don't think so. The court said you can't do something indirectly that you can't do directly, but they have to clarify the issue.
To draw out this distinction that Bill is making in the Harvard case, Harvard admitted that race was sometimes used as what they called a tip for some applicants to get them over the bar to admission. There were also allegations that Asian applicants to Harvard mysteriously were given lower personal scores than other applicants. And so there were some direct touches on race that were in dispute here. And in the Thomas Jefferson case, these are neutral policies, as Bill says. To read a line from his column, one of the new admissions criteria is a guarantee that 1.5% of every eighth grade class in Fairfax County would be admitted. But Kim, if you go and look at the cert petition that the parents have filed to the Supreme Court asking to take the case, it seems that there's not really a lack of clarity about what the school board was intending to do. They quote, for example, TJ's principal at the time saying that the school did not reflect the racial composition of Fairfax County Public Schools. Board members saying that they intended to change that. And so, Kim, just to underline the point Bill made, this is a case that is racially neutral changes to the admissions criteria, but those changes seem to have been clearly made in order to get a racially balanced result.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know if you could therefore call them racially neutral. I mean, they weren't overtly racial. And I think that the Coalition for TJ has a really good point in this brief in saying that the problem that the school district has is that it was very blunt dissent and saying that it was essentially its goal to discriminate against Asian Americans. Now, it didn't put it in those terms. It put it in a much more friendly, uplifting way, saying, what we need to do is increase our diversity, and we need to boost the number of Blacks and Latinos and low-income people and girls who get into this school. And this was, by the way, when the Fourth Circuit upheld this whole new regime that they had put into place. They essentially grabbed onto that and said this wasn't necessarily to discriminate against Asian Americans. It was only to help out others. And I think one of the things that the Coalition for TJ points out very correctly in their brief is it doesn't really matter what your intentions are. We have a history of Supreme Court decisions making that point. Just because you have good intentions for something, it doesn't make it any less racist. Another argument that the school district used, and that was part of the Fourth Circuit reasoning, is that somehow using all of these proxies for race are okay if the overall enrollment at the school doesn't turn out to make Asian Americans have a presence there that is less than others. So as long as it's on parity with others, somehow that's acceptable. That's a very slippery slope. What is the right amount of discrimination that you can have against a group? As Bill noted, this was a category of people that went from about 73% of the school's student body to 54% under these new proxy measures for race. So they've got a couple of problems in that this seems to be very much out of keeping with the recent Supreme Court decision of earlier this year. And they're also on the record of essentially laying out what they were attempting to do by creating this whole proxy system for race.
But Bill, is the importance for the justices of following up the Students for Fair Admissions case, is the importance of following that up because the Students for Fair Admissions case itself dealt with the facts on the ground at Harvard and at the University of North Carolina. But there are all sorts of other ways that those schools or other schools could try to achieve the same ends that they were trying to do that were at issue in Students for Fair Admissions, but using other means, sneakier means. And so is the importance of following that decision up to try to tamp down on that and to make clear that the Supreme Court and the appellate courts are going to police that. It's not as if Harvard can go back and rejigger its personal ratings in such a way that it has the same effect, but is harder to see and harder to uncover.
Kim mentioned the indirect way they're doing it. If you think of it, it wasn't really neutral. I mean, all the discussion leading up to the admission changes was how can we reduce the number of Asian Americans? So it's kind of like what you saw in the South during the Jim Crow era. There might be ostensibly neutral things like demanding a literacy test or a poll tax to vote, but they were specifically imposed to reduce the number of Black voters. And that's kind of what they're alleging here. Remember, Chief Justice John Roberts said eliminating discrimination means eliminating all discrimination. And so this is one of the test cases and one of the easiest cases, the way to get around it. Remember, when the Supreme Court first took the cases on Harvard and North Carolina, Lawrence Tribe, a constitutional law professor at Harvard, said he had no doubt that they were going to come down the way they eventually did. But he said, don't worry, universities like Harvard are smart, and they're going to find a way more or less to keep doing what they're doing, but be more subtle about it. And I think that's what you're alluding to. And I think the Coalition for TJ and the Pacific Legal Foundation representing them is arguing just because it's sneaky doesn't make it constitutional. This is a case of discrimination. That was the intent. And maybe they could give us kind of clear guidelines for finding that intent.
But it seems to me that the reason this TJ case is perhaps a good one for the Supreme Court is their failure to be as sneaky as maybe they would have been had these conversations about the TJ admissions policies been happening after the Supreme Court's recent ruling against affirmative action in Harvard and the University of North Carolina. And the difficulty, it seems to me, Kim, in the future is going to be deciding what the intent really is. I mean, you can imagine a state legislature, just to make up an example, thinking that our public universities are supported by tax dollars. They've gotten in the habit of taking too many students, so we're going to make a rule where these colleges have to take the top X percent of every high school. That will be a way to help kids in rural areas where the high schools maybe don't have AP classes, they don't have the resources of the capital city schools. So really non-racial at all goals being met there. But you can also imagine a state legislature doing those exact same things for racial purposes that they're trying to hide. And so, Kim, I mean, the difficulty I think here will, in some of these cases, be trying to figure out what the policy is actually intended to do.
The Supreme Court has an enormous challenge ahead of it here. And I couldn't agree with Bill more that let's hope it takes up a case like this. And in doing so, doesn't just deal with the particular scheme at hand that's being implemented by Thomas Jefferson High School. Let's hope it tries to come up with some sort of test or more broadly addresses all of the different sneakiness, as Bill was saying, that is already going on both at the college level and at the high school level in some cases, anywhere where there has been or was a competitive admissions process, because we're already seeing this happening everywhere. We're seeing colleges, they're sending out hints to potential applicants saying, write this in your essay and it'll tip us off to whether or not you might fulfill a category for us. They're increasingly putting an emphasis on socioeconomic status, on the idea that that is a proxy for certain races who might be coming in. Notably, and it was interesting because this might be a chance to clarify this question that you just noted, Kyle. You have indeed had more states moving to this idea of saying, well, certainly in the public university sphere, we're just going to take the top, 8%, 10% of every high school. Notably, the Coalition for TJ makes the argument that the similar situation that is going on with the feeder schools into TJ and these numbers of people, they're taking the top numbers of each school, they're saying that that essentially falls back into quota territory, which is something that the Supreme Court refused to tenet a long time ago. This is an opportunity. We could end up with a situation, which the Supreme Court's done in the past, where they deal with these cases on a one-by-one basis as they come along. I think it was great that they wrote the decision that they did against Harvard and University of North Carolina. And note that John Roberts did say in that opinion, what cannot be done directly may not be done indirectly. So they were sending that warning, but they might need to take up another case, and hopefully just one where they really settle a lot of these questions once and for all.